Hi, everyone, and welcome to Katie Couric. It was 1939. Great Britain had declared war on Germany, and a British monarch addressed the world on the radio. His speech was about the resilience of the British people, but privately, it was a testament to his own strength and ability to overcome a debilitating impediment. In the new film, The King's Speech, Colin Firth plays George VI, and his performance will leave you, well, speechless. As always, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Dove. Colin Firth, I'm so happy to see you. First of all, did you know much about George VI before you took this role on?
No, I think unless people are focused on the royal family and
enjoy
the gossip around it and the history, no, I don't think most people do. Not my generation.
So
I knew about the stutter.
You knew about the stutter.
And the abdication, and that was it. You know, I think most, as I said, most Brits of my generation are not particularly focused on the affairs of the royal family unless a big moment comes along, you know. And I remember my mother expressing sympathy and admiration for this man who didn't want the job, didn't expect the job, and had to take it in spite of this impediment. And, you know, it's a heck of a job to take if you suffer from this. I mean, this is an interval in history where live radio had just come in. I mean, this was an extraordinary new technology, and had he been born a generation earlier, he would have escaped that. And had he been born a generation later, it would have been edited and recorded. This was live to millions of people around the world. I
don't think many Americans really knew much about him at all.
No, we don't either. It's one of the things that fascinates me about attacking the story was that in some ways he's in the margins of popular history. You know, I think anyone who knows anything about that era will have heard something about the abdication and Wallace Simpson. It's a story which captivates people, whether they find it romantic or scandalous or whatever. This guy was a bit of a footnote in a way. And if you look closely, I think you find that he merits more than that. And I'm always fascinated with following a seemingly minor character off stage and seeing where they go.
Well, it is interesting because I do think you're right. Everyone knows the famous speech, you know, I cannot carry on my duties without the help or whatever of the woman I love. But I think few people know sort of what followed as a result, because that was so scandalous or romantic, as you said, depending on your point of view.
Yeah.
Just for people who haven't seen the film, tell me a little bit about this impediment that Bertie, Albert, suffered from a very young age.
We can only guess from what we've read, what we've heard, and what we've seen. This footage you can get hold of. It's not easy, but you can find, you know, visual footage of this man making speeches, and you see him running into this problem. It's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, I choked up watching it.
Really?
Yeah, it's very moving because it's not just the struggle, it's the courage with which he deals with the struggle. The guy, he just does it. He gets on with it. He goes through a silence which probably seems like an eternity. And then something in your heart swells when you see him get beyond it and get another 3 or 4 words out before he hits another one.
You find yourself cheering him on to just get through that sentence, don't you? And then you notice in the movie it becomes uncomfortable for people. It's sort of, they go through almost these stages of looking at him and cheering him on, and then discomfort, and, you know, it's interesting.
It was scary for us to tread the line of that comfort level, actually, because I think if we made you, the viewer, too uncomfortable, then we alienate you, and I think we had to be very careful not to do that. Without, at the same time, we couldn't compromise how painful it is, and so it's a balance all the time.
It's interesting because a friend I watched the movie with said, you know, it was really hard for me to get through the first half of the movie because I felt really uncomfortable.
Well, you imagine what it was like for the people who loved him. You know, the writer of this script had struggled with a stammer through all his childhood, most of his life as well, which is what inspired him to write it. He was born, I think, the year that George VI came to the throne, so 1937, and he heard him on the radio as a child. So you have a child who suffers from a stammer, who hears the King of England making speeches, wartime speeches, and he thought, if the King of England can do that in spite of his stammer, then so can I. It inspired him, it gave him hope. And he wrote to the Queen Mother, who's this man's wife, many years later, saying, I want to tell this story. Do I have your permission? Do I have your blessing? And she said, please, not in my lifetime. The memories of these events are still too painful. And being a very honorable person, he he decided to wait, little knowing that the Queen Mother was going to live another 30 years. You know, she was already getting on when he wrote that letter. So, you know, she lived till 101, and he waited. And had she said yes, I'd have been too young for the role. I mean, that's the time difference. So I think it must have been just as hard for her as it was for him, because you can't, if you're rooting for someone who's struggling with that, you cannot do anything about it. While he's standing there in front of a live microphone, you can sit there and pray, but you can't actually stand there and take away the problem.
So at the time of her death, the writer said, well, now I can do this.
I think he felt he was now free to do it, yeah.
So that was very respectful, by the way, you know. And he must be an older gentleman himself, in his 70s now.
And he was my greatest source of research, really, because, you know, he was so eloquent about what it's like to struggle with it. He said it was like being underwater. He said it was a drowning sensation, that you can't, when you're stuck in that terrible abyss, that silence, which you can see no end to. It's not just words that don't come, but your breath doesn't come either, and it consumes the way you go about your days. It's all you think about. It's how you decide what to order in a restaurant, how you pick up the phone. You go to a meeting, you don't worry about the results of the meeting beyond whether you can actually speak at it. So it's something that consumes you entirely, I think.
So in addition to talking to him, and what is this gentleman's name? This isn't Tom.
This is David Seidler.
David Seidler, who wrote the screenplay.
The screenplay, that's right.
So in addition to speaking with him about the anguish of having this kind of handicap, and also watching what you could get your hands on in terms of King Charles himself speaking, anything else you did to prepare for this role?
Well, it's not just about the stammer, of course. You know, the Brits spoke differently back then, as did the Americans, I think. A language evolves and the vernacular evolves, and if you listen to recordings of news broadcasts or movies of that period, it's a different sound. It's more clipped. It sounds, it just sounds, it speaks of reserve to me and a formality. And
I think you're right, having remembered how the speech sounded, and even thinking about FDR recordings. You know, I think it was just less fluent and conversational and more.
I think so. You know, I mean, these were new mediums that people were dealing with, whether it be radio or television. And, you know, the British version would be, you know, the old Pathe news broadcast would be tapping the R's, saying terribly, terribly, you know, and just a little bit higher up. And when we go back 70 years and make films about that period, we don't usually bother with that. You know, most of us will just say, we'll just ignore the fact that the sound has changed. Tom Hooper, our director, was concerned that we maintained it. He thought it was too valuable to what these characters are going through. All that formality, all that authority, all that protocol, all that, you know, propriety that people are observing was expressed in the voice. And this man, so the stammer was one part of it. He also had an issue with his R. Might is right. He wasn't able to.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Did you notice that?
Yeah.
And he had that as well. And I think R was probably about the only sound he did not stammer on that I could find. But all of that.
A lot of trouble with P's.
He did. P was a problem, and yes, I mean, I heard listening to speeches where you do hear the problem with the P, a problem with S, you have a problem with W. And he had a big problem with K, which, if you have to regularly toast the king, is a huge issue. And he was afraid of math class because F was a problem and they were doing fractions. You know, as I said, it basically diverted him through all his pursuits in life. One of the things I think that people grew to love about him, though, was that he was struggling with them during a wartime. I think if you're listening to a piece of symbolic rhetoric, well, you are being bombed, or you've lost loved ones, or you're in a hospital or something, and someone broadcasts from the comfort of a palace and says, I'm with you every step of the way, you're not going to buy it, really. But people knew that this man was facing his demons just by speaking to them. And I think there was a sense that it cost him something, and they found it valiant. And there's also something that strikes me when you look at his adversaries, who were the best in the business, Hitler and Mussolini, who used this medium to mesmerize the masses. They wanted power very badly. This man didn't want it. And I think that gave him credibility as well. So when he was responding to that toxic philosophy in continental Europe. It was taking over these, and he talks in our film, in the speech, about this primitive doctrine that might is right. He doesn't believe in that doctrine. He didn't want any for himself. So I think all of those things connected with people.
And that's such a wonderful scene where he finally is able to, well, he's in the position of having to rally Great Britain on the brink of war, or announcing the country was in fact at war, and that is sort of the climax of the movie. But let's go back for a minute, Colin, and talk about this incredible relationship he had with a voice coach or a speech therapist named Lionel Lionel Logue. Basically, his wife discovered that the speech pathologist or therapist, not really pathologist, therapist,
it wasn't
was
an
around.
established science at the time, I don't believe, so I think one could probably just debate the accurate label. And we find out in the film he's not professionally qualified anyway.
Right. But a lot of the movie obviously is on his relationship with Lionel. And tell me a little bit about their extraordinary friendship, which lasted their entire lives after they met in this way.
Well, I think one of the main things to point out is the humor. Now, that could easily look like a conceit of our writer, and it was, up to a point, but we found Lionel Logue's diaries. I mean, this was an extraordinary advent. It was like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls or something. And there's so much we had to guess at, and there's so much that had come from David Seidler's imagination, as well as from the rigorous research he'd done in books and all. But to find the family about, I think, 9 weeks before we started shooting the film.
Wow.
And the grandson saying, by the way, would you be at all interested? I've got all these, memoirs and letters and accounts of their conversations. Would we be interested? And it's full of the same humor that David had set out. So he'd guessed it perfectly. And as I said, some of it's documented anyway. But the line towards the end of the film, after the speech, where Logue says to him, "You still stammered on the W." And then Bertie says, "I had to throw in one or two so they knew it was me." That's from the diary.
Really?
We found that exchange between the two guys, and it's evidence that they had fun, that they used humor as, I think, a way of diffusing tension. It's very badly needed in a film where there's a lot of tension, as you were saying. And we had no idea how much people were going to laugh, when they saw the film. But we know that he was unorthodox. We know he was unconventional. But we don't know precisely what methods he used, because he did not keep account of his sessions. Otherwise, you'd have to suspect him as a therapist. But we know that there was a bond that grew between them. And I think it was as much of a healing factor for Bertie as anything else, because he just didn't have friendship.
That's what struck me about the movie. I mean, I felt as if he was really his therapist and his friend, because he was so buttoned up, obviously, because of his circumstances, your character, Bertie, that he never really had anyone. I mean, you felt that he had a wonderful relationship with his wife, but nobody he could really talk to about his problems, about his childhood. I'm sure he didn't even share those things with his wife. And the whole stiff upper lip thing. And you really feel in the movie that there's a breakthrough, not just in terms of his ability to speak, but in his ability to communicate.
Absolutely. I think this is why people, rather improbably, are responding to it, no matter where they're from or what generation they are. I was afraid when we were making this film that it was going to appeal to just a certain demographic, people who are interested in period drama, people who, I don't know, interested in royalty, or people who are interested in therapy or something. But actually, it seems to be just about everybody. And I'm trying to make sense of why it seems so universal. And I do think there's a certain... there are issues about intimacy which we all struggle with, and difficulties in reaching each other that we all struggle with. It's very difficult to reach another person. And I think this is about two very brave men, one who has no idea that he's brave. Bertie just thinks that he only knows his fear. He doesn't understand that he's got these virtues. And the therapist who decides he's going to find every means possible to reach that damaged place. And I think there's a real beauty to that. And when as the film goes on, I find you look at Geoffrey Rush's character and you think that's the guy we all wish we had in our lives to turn to. He won't give up. He will, if he reaches a barrier, he will find a stealthy way around it to just try to open this man up. And it's a heightened version of issues, I think, which, as I said, do apply to a lot of people. We all have protocols which protect us. We all have good manners. We dress nicely. We groom ourselves. We have taboos. And those are there for probably very good reasons. But they can also isolate us. And this is an extreme example of that. By making this story, by focusing this story on a member of the royal family, you have a man who has an exclusion zone around him, which consists of a lot of titles, the fact that you can't even shake hands with him unless he offers his hand first. He's got about 5 names you have to get through before you can address him. And he lives behind very, very high walls with armed guards. That's not an easy man to reach, even if he doesn't have speech problems and even if he isn't personally reserved. And the first thing that Geoffrey's character does when we sit down is he moves his chair away. It's a kind of mischievous gesture of saying, okay, you know, I'm not allowed to get close. And I think Bertie picks that up, and a kind of sparring session ensues from that. And that sets it up. And I think everything after that really is this bromance. That's what we came to be known on our set.
Bromance between you and Geoffrey Rush?
Yeah.
If you had to say, though, why this movie is resonating, what would you say?
I think anything that feels truthful in terms of friendship appeals to people. It's hard to do. It's hard to write. It's hard to perform. It's quite hard to make it authentic. I've tried many times and it has not worked out. And I think this one feels real. I think it doesn't overlook the difficulties in a real friendship. It doesn't overlook the imperfections. It makes both characters flawed. Despite the way I've just eulogized the Logue figure, you see his flaws. You see the fact that he's a little bit starstruck. You see the fact that maybe he's pushing a little too hard, that maybe his ambitions for this man exceed the man's ambitions for himself in not necessarily a good way. And you see my character's petulance and resistance to being helped and occasional self-pity. And it doesn't sugar that, but it also, because they are, I think we avoid the self-pity, because I was afraid of a kind of poor little rich boy story. And the fact that they both have a sense of humor about the problem, I think means that everybody gets let in. And I think everybody has fears. Everybody has anxiety dreams. Everybody that has a moment when, you know, here you are, you're up. It's not a million miles, frankly, from Rocky or 8 Mile. You know, you have you have the underdog who starts off in a situation where he seems to be failing catastrophically, and a long journey to the big fight, and the moment of terrible doubt before the big fight, and then the big fight. And I think it's I'd rather call it an archetype than a stereotype, but I think it follows that pattern.
A lot too is a lot of the focus is also on Bertie's relationship with his wife. We were talking before the camera started rolling about Helena Bonham Carter, who's just so wonderful in this role, and I thought their relationship was so well defined. I just thought she was great, and I love when she said to him, "I didn't want this life." I'm not remembering exactly what she said, but because you had a stammer, I didn't think I would have this royal life. In other words, they were unsuspecting monarchs.
He'd ambushed both of them, and she did turn him down 3 times. I'm not quite sure why, and I think there are different interpretations, but I know he proposed to her 3 times before she accepted, and I think the reason was because she didn't really want that much attention, even when if he was just going to be Duke of York. So, and we know how tough she is. There's some quote about her that Helena found, a marshmallow wrought in iron or something. She had the soft qualities and the tough qualities, and she had mischief, and I think that probably was as much of a saving grace for him as anything else.
We have a clip, actually, which I should have played earlier, Colin, when Lionel Logue meets Bertie for the first time in his office. So let's take a look at that, and we'll talk some more.
What'll I call you?
Your Royal Highness. Then sir, after that.
How about Bertie?
Only my family uses that.
Well, in here, it's better if we're equals.
If we were equals, I wouldn't be here. I'd be at home with my wife, and no one would give a damn.
Well, please don't do that.
I'm sorry.
I believe sucking smoke into your lungs will kill you.
My physicians say it relaxes the throat.
They're idiots.
They've all been knighted.
Makes it official, then.
I just thought I love Jeffrey Rush in this movie so much as well. Was it fun to work with him? Is he just as great as he seems?
Both of them, Helen and Jeffrey. It was a free ride. You know, if you're working with someone that good, you just react. You know, he's a very generous actor. He's very engaged. He's a complete workaholic as well. But I don't know when Jeffrey sleeps or you know, stops being fascinated with things. I mean, when he's not applying himself to the text or turning over lines of dialogue and questioning how they should be interpreted and going through bits of history and discovering things, he's being silly and entertaining us all, and he's just the most engaging person. It was this film was comprised of very long hours and long days, and it wasn't an easy shoot, and we were exhausted, and I was filming from home, but my family had to really say goodbye to me for 3 months. And I have to say rather guiltily that at the end of a day, you know, you'd start at 6 and end up at 9 o'clock, finally released to go home, but Jeffrey and I would just stay on set, you know, well, it got dark, you know, or everyone was locking up the trailers, still talking about the day or talking about tomorrow, and it was a compulsive process, and that's how much fun it was. I mean, I just sort of threw away my downtime.
Is it true that you had a hard time getting rid of the stammer after the shooting had ended?
You're probably going to cue a stammer right now. If you start to think about your fluency, you do so at your peril. It's not a stammer. I think it's just very interesting. I could start to get technical, and I don't know what I'm talking about. But I met the head of the British Stammering Association about a month ago, who'd seen the film, and he talked about various neurological components, which I didn't really know about.
Right.
And I think there's a debate still going on about what it is. But I talked about this fluency issue, and there are various technical terms for that as well, and he said that's not the same thing. That's just getting your words in a tangle, or sometimes you can get paralyzed between two choices of how to phrase something. But it definitely interfered with my fluency, which is not always there anyway. I mean, it's an English quality that we affect to splutter a bit when we speak. But I found myself, because I mean, you can train your memory into habits. This is how people learn musical instruments. You learn sports this way. You repeat a way of doing something, and it becomes second nature. And if you hesitate every 3 words for 3 months, then that can start to become a kind of programming. So that's what happened. And I was working with Derek Jacobi, who's one of our greatest actors, who plays the Archbishop of Canterbury and who played Claudius in I, Claudius in the 70s, one of the most famously brilliant portrayals of a stammer that I've ever seen. And it was a little intimidating to have the master of the art on the set. And he warned me about it. He said, you could find it lingering for a couple of months. It will go away. So yes, there were a couple of press conferences where I found myself in a bit of a hole.
I wondered why Lionel didn't put the earphones on your head during that speech, that very, very famous speech that Bertie gave, King Charles. Because when he first met you, he put the earphones on, played loud music in your ear, and you flawlessly read To Be or Not to Be.
Yes, well, for one thing, it's not quite flawless. It's a very good question, actually. I mean, we'd have to ask Logue. But I think that he probably wouldn't have been in full control of an 8-minute speech if he had music blaring to that extent. You know, I think he was making a point that your stammer isn't a permanent part of you, or you can manage it differently, but you can't walk around with Mozart or Beethoven bursting your eardrums as a way of solving the problem, because you're not in communication with anybody. So I'm clutching at straws for an answer there, but that's probably why.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it seemed probably not practical either, but we all in the car, as we were discussing the film, thought, well, if he did such a good job reading that, could he have done that for an 8 or 9 minute speech? But maybe he didn't want him to rely on that.
He would have had the gramophone in the room. He would have had to put the things on, and he probably wouldn't have judged his own volume of his own voice. But I dare say it might have worked.
Can we talk about how historically significant Colin George VI was at that particular time in British history, and the historical significance of that speech?
I think you'd have to ask historians, and they would probably argue. Obviously, the person who gets the most credit for huge impact, quite justifiably, is Churchill. There's even a hint, and I think this is not even verifiable, let alone verified, but we got a rumor that Churchill was the author of the speech. And we play with that a little bit when one of the things you hear when George VI comes out from delivering it is he runs, Churchill's one of the people there, and he says, couldn't have said it better myself. And it's a kind of cheeky reference to the fact perhaps he did say it. And
or write it anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
But at that moment in time, even regardless of who might be responsible for the writing, that moment, it seems so incredibly critical to, you alluded to it earlier, to the British people to hear from this man.
It was a slow burn. People had to come round to King George VI in the wake of Edward VIII, who was extremely popular, as David. He was a charmer. He was charismatic. He went on tours of this country, of Europe, and people fell in love with him everywhere he went. He was good-looking, he was blue-eyed, he was absolutely Prince Charming.
I found him so gross, by the way.
Thank you, bless you. No, Bertie was definitely the uncharismatic, relation in that respect. Now, our film is flipping history. We're taking the A plot and making that the B plot, and we're looking at it from another angle. So I suppose you're meant to find him, unappealing, because he's also causing all these problems, and he's represented in our film as extremely narcissistic, and historians and biographers will argue over that as well. But had Edward VIII come to the throne, English history would undoubtedly be different. And again, I don't have any final answers as to what history would have been, but he was very good friends with Hitler. He and Wallace spent some quality time with Ribbentrop and Hitler, in the wake of the abdication. I think it's probably, I don't know if we can view Hitler through his eyes. I don't doubt how much about the Holocaust he would have known at that time. Nothing. Hadn't really, I'm going to get down that history lesson, but nevertheless, I'm not going to be an apologist for him. There's even a letter from Bertie, I think, to the American ambassador saying, we know that my brother is half Nazi. It was clearly an issue very early on, I think even before the war. And there's a letter from Bertie to David after the abdication saying, you left me with a wobbling throne. And his brother saying, how dare you, it was perfectly stable. The monarchy could well have collapsed. The government was about to resign en masse, and monarchies had been collapsing over Europe for the last few decades. There were different ideologies kicking in. The whole Russian royal family had been killed. Germany had lost its Kaiser. The Italians didn't have a king anymore. The French had chopped the king's head off a couple of hundred years before. They were not stable entities, and I think it is very reasonably arguable that Bertie saved the monarchy and gave it its present ethos, which is one of humble stability in a way, despite all the pageantry and the money, and they have a lot, and the gilt carriages and all the rest. There's a very, very straightforward sense of duty that our current queen has, and this is his daughter. And that is a very, very different legacy, I think, had we had Edward VIII instead. So I think it's probably significant from that point of view. Whether we believe there should be a monarchy or not is another argument. But for reasons I think I gave, I think the voice that he represented in sheer contrast to Hitler became something valuable. I think people felt there was something genuinely, quietly heroic about him, rather than, you know, this power maniac across the lines.
In the newsreels, Bertie is fascinated, maybe even a bit envious, of Hitler's uncanny and enviable ability to communicate, no matter what the message may be.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think it's significant that he doesn't understand what Hitler is saying. I mean, hey, I think they all have a fair idea by that point, and even that broadcast draws attention to the fact that it's rather sinister. You know, there's this stupefying to the eye or something like that. He says, these massive armed men. But his daughter says, "What's he saying, Daddy?" And he says, "I don't know, but I think he's saying it rather well." So all Bertie's really tuning into at that moment, in a way, I mean, obviously he's aware of the menace, but he's tuning into the brilliance of delivery, thinking, you know, here am I can't even get 2 words out in front of a microphone. And here's this man who's using it to the most devastating effect on a global level. How do I stand a chance? You know, what would it be like to have that ability? You know?
So now that you're finished with this wonderful movie and talking about it and all this Oscar talk, does that make you feel good? Does it make you kind of feel uncomfortable, or?
You just have to plead the fifth. You know,
this must be flattering, though.
Oh, it's
nice
great
to have a movie that's so well received.
Jeffrey's got the right answer to this, actually. He says it's code for "we love your movie," and you know, that talk has come out of festivals, which is, you know, and the screenings where it's been seen, and it's a tiny movie, really. It was made for either $12 to $15 million or something, and it can only thrive on that kind of appreciation. It hasn't got a huge financial machine behind it. So if people love it at festivals and people like yourself say nice things about it and support it, that is entirely the fuel for the film. That's all it will survive on. So if people give it that kind of buzz, then, you know, it's everything we hope for, and it functions entirely on that sort of thing. So we can only be grateful for it.
So what are you doing now? Are you after you shill for this film? Just kidding, Colin.
I'm filming.
You are? What are you working on?
It's a good place to be, actually, when you're promoting something and when people are making a wonderful fuss over what you're doing. I'm doing a film called Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which is a John le Carré spy novel from the 70s to do with the Cold War. An extraordinary director called Thomas Alfredson, who's Swedish. He did a film called Let the Right One In, which has just been remade as Let Me In here. He caught my attention with that film. And it is a very interesting, very complex human spy story, I think.
You must feel so fortunate that these wonderful roles continue to find you and you them. But a Single Man, right, was very well received, and your performance praised, and so things are going well.
The roles were just a gift, and I make no assumption that it's going to continue. You can't. And I'm very fortunate at my age that it's working that way rather than the other way. It can be very hard for actors as they get older to find things that suit them. Women struggle more than men in that respect in just finding the material. Long may it continue. It's interesting, the texture has got more interesting with age. I think the stories are more interesting. I'm playing people who have a past, and that adds substance to them.
Well, Colin Firth, it's great to see you, and thanks for being so generous with your time. And the movie is called The King's Speech, and I, for one, loved it and really enjoyed the film, as did the friends I saw it with. So good luck with it. I hope it does well, just because it's so beautifully done and it's elevating, you know, in many ways.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's what this critic thinks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. And thank you all for watching. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Couric. Actually, I tweeted a photo. Remember, I made my daughter take that picture of us?
Oh, that's out there?
I tweeted it.
Yeah.
You know, hey, every little bit helps, right? Yeah. And you can see all the episodes of this web show anytime at cbsnews.com. Now stay tuned for
Take two.
Now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.